So now we have a talk about the survey cadence optimization process, basically from here to a final survey recommendation. Take it away, Zeljko.
Thanks, Lynn, and thank you for organizing this session. I will spend only a few minutes to give you news about the Survey Cadence Optimization Committee that was recently stood up. I will refer to it as the committee. There is also new cadence optimization information webpage listed below, and I'll get to that link again later. You can also just Google for LSST SCOC and you'll get to this page. So I will have only a few slides. I'll address 2 points. One is to summarize the committee's charge, and then I'll introduce one slide with cadence optimization schedule that is also linked to that webpage I just showed you, and just go briefly over the logic behind it. So we stood up this committee because we want to make the Rubin Observatory LSST, the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, to be as good as it possibly can be given the observing system that we are about to complete and given observing conditions and science. And last but not least, all the scientists and their interests invested in its mission and legacy. And so to optimize the deployment of this very complex and very powerful system that will soon start taking data, there will be delay, of course, due to COVID, unfortunately, but at this point, I think we can claim with high confidence level that LSST will be taking data in some reasonable amount of time from now. So we need to complete this process of optimization of the survey strategy and finish the code that will actually drive this essentially robotic observatory. So to collect the best minds and the best expertise we can, we obviously need to reach beyond the project. And that's what we did. And it was not exclusively, but by and large drawn from LSST science collaborations. So I want to thank at this point the Science Advisory Committee and its chair, Michael Strauss, who came up with this charge and who led the standing up of this committee. This committee is envisioned to be a standing committee throughout the life of the Rubin Observatory operations during the 10 years that LSST will be undertaken. And their first task will be to make specific recommendation for the cadence choices for the full 10-year survey. We do understand that our understanding of the system will improve with time, that the system itself will evolve, as well as science drivers will evolve. And it is quite likely that we will modify this strategy as we go. But at this point, in an idealized way, we are planning for a 10-year survey, and we want to make specific recommendation for its strategy. Then we want the committee to help us communicate these recommendations to the science community at large, and in particular science collaborations of LSST. Then next task, once we settle on this overall strategy, will be to see how we can improve it, how can we modify it to maximize the amount of early science that will come out from the survey, where early science is defined as all the science that will be produced prior to data release 1. And then during operations, with the help of Survey Evaluation Committee or working group that Lynn Jones will be chairing and leading, we want this committee of external experts to help us track survey progress and make recommendations for any changes as our understanding of the system itself, and science drivers evolve. So bottom line is we want this committee to be expert, to be transparent, to be diverse, and to be inclusive. And I'm happy that I think by and large we achieve all these goals. Another detail I want to emphasize, the full charge is available at that public web page that I gave you at the beginning. And the charge is longer than what I'm discussing today in the interest of time. But what I want to emphasize is that the job of these people is not to advocate for a particular science goals for their science, but instead it is to optimize the global scientific productivity of our survey. So just like the Science Advisory Committee or the internal project science team that we have, we will try to work global system level and increase productivity, rather than have what people call cadence wars. I'd prefer the terminology that Phil Marshall introduced of cadence diplomacy. We will try to define the scientific goals that we want to achieve and then try to optimize the system as much as we can quantitatively along these guidelines. We want to include advice from scientists, from our stakeholders, from science collaborations. So as opposed to have a dark smoky room where 11 or 12 wise people will make decisions, we want this process to be open, transparent, and to include input and advice from members of our stakeholders. And we also want communication process to be open. And so ideally, what I'd like at the end of this process is that if some other committee of completely different people were given the same input as this committee will have, hopefully they would come with a final recommendation that is more or less identical to what this committee would produce. That's in idealized case, how I would like this to see unfold. Here are the members. They are by and large drawn from our science collaborations. There are two ex officio members, Lynn Jones and myself. We are non-voting members, and the rest of people will be voting, and they are SCOC members drawn from science collaborations. Again, they are not meant to represent or advocate for their science collaborations, but rather to optimize the whole system from some global point of view, science-driven global point of view. So here is a summary. That's my last slide. Here is a high-level summary of timeline that we will follow in order to reach this final recommendation. So the central date here is the end of the next calendar year in blue font, December 31, 21, where we would like to see the finalized SCOC recommendation to the project, to the operations director, who will then take this recommendation and declare the survey strategy that will be followed at least for about first year of the survey. So we are now at PCW at the first entry in this timeline. And the first important date after this will be November, when we will organize a virtual workshop. And the purpose of this first virtual workshop will be to enable the committee to receive detailed and quantitative feedback from the LSST science collaborations about the new generation of over 100 simulated surveys that Lynn Jones and Peter Joachim produced, and that are described in a major report that we just issued, Jones et al., that will form the basis for our science stakeholders to assess how these different families of collaborations produce data that would be relevant for their science. So we will, at that workshop, discuss white papers that we will again solicit, that these white papers will be much shorter. We envision them to be much shorter than the last round of white papers that proposed these simulations. But we want to have a traceable, brief inputs, quantitative inputs to the SCOC about how available families of simulations described in that report, how they work or don't work for specific science goals. So we are not asking for completely new cadence ideas. We are asking you to look at these 100+ simulations and tell us how they work or don't work in terms of your own science. And then we will also aim for another workshop, probably in the fall of 21. So that will be discussion of the final detailed optimization of the observing strategy recommended by the SCOC. So by that time, we anticipate the committee will already communicate to stakeholders which way they are going in their analysis. And so that will be the last chance then to talk with SCOC for all of us to get together and discuss pros and cons of this initial final recommendation. And then with that input, we expect SCOC will go back home, and by the end of this calendar year, next calendar year, they will issue the final recommendation. And then afterwards, we'll produce again a suite of simulations that will now follow the same strategy, but they will be fine-tuning various knobs that we have in simulations. And we might even have the third workshop sometime in late 22. Recall that we were supposed to start operations on October 1, 22, but because of COVID delays, we got at least extra 9 months that we can now use to improve the schedule. So the schedule is extended and it has many more entries than before. So we will assess in early 22 whether this third workshop is needed or not. And we are aiming that by the end of 22, our team, Lynn and Peter and others, will produce the simulation of the final adopted observing strategy. And then people can use that simulation then to do more detailed assessment of how they will do science with LSSD. Meanwhile, on the project side, we will take those guidelines and we will essentially freeze them in the code. We will implement them in the scheduler, which is part of Observatory control system that will eventually operate the survey. That does not mean that we will never again change the strategy. That just means that we will do thorough testing prior to commissioning and simulation in operations, that we are capable of executing that strategy in practice and drive the system, drive the hardware. So I will stop here. To summarize, we do have that public webpage where much more information is available, including this schedule, and more importantly, including the Jones et al. Report about these 100+ science cadence simulations. And I hope you'll be perusing all that information and eventually looking at your own science metrics for that suite of simulations. Thanks.
Thanks, Zeljko. I want to add a little plug for community.lssd.org as another place that you can discuss some of these runs and simulations and evaluations in progress and on an ongoing basis as well. It's sort of separate than the SCOC, but it's a nice place to discuss things.
Thanks, Lynn. Have fun, everyone.
Thanks.